Hi, this is Matt Pullen, and today we are going to be journeying into the world of the two knights defense. The two knights defense is defined by bishop c4 and knight f6 for black. And right away you'll notice that it's a counter-attack on the pawn on e4. And if white plays knight c3, then what we have is a four knights game with bishop c4, which I talked about in my last video. Black can use the fork trick, knight takes e4. So knight c3 would lead to the four knights game, but knight g5 is a lot more critical for black because the attack on f7 compels black to sacrifice a pawn. After d5, e takes d5. There are several choices for black in this position. By far the most popular is knight a5, which makes the gambit permanent after bishop b5 check, c6, d takes c, b takes c, bishop e2, h6, knight f3. This is how the main line two knights defense starts. Black is down a pawn, but he controls all the space in the center, and his goal is to show that the activity he has and attacking chances are worth more than the pawn. So that is how the main line, knight a5, is usually played. You might ask, what about just knight takes pawn? It's a natural reaction. He takes my pawn, I take his. But knight takes d5 has a very poor reputation because of this move, the fried liver attack. This forces black's king to take on f7, and then queen f3 check attacks the knight on d5. So in order to defend it, black needs to move his king even further into the center. Knight c3 attacks this pinned piece again, and after a move like knight b4 to defend it, black has a very unpleasant defense ahead of him. Even though he is up a piece, very few players would willingly play this for black. In addition to the fried liver, the move d4, called the lolly, is also very strong. It protects the knight on g5 and prepares queen f3, which attacks the knight and the f7 pawn. Both the lolly and the fried liver score over 83% for white. It's a very good reason to avoid playing knight takes pawn in this position. So, what are other options for black? Well, one of them is the Ulvestad variation, which I highly recommend. After b5, it's a counterattack on white's bishop. The correct move to play here, the theoretically correct move, I've never seen anyone play this in a tournament, and in your games I think it will be very rare for your opponent to come up with this move unless they've actually studied this theory. The correct move is bishop to f1. It looks very strange to undevelop this piece, but it's justified by tactical means. I'll talk about that later. Much more common is bishop takes b5, and this allows queen takes d5, attacking the bishop and the g2 pawn, so white usually decides to trade the bishop for the knight. And in this position, g2 is still hanging, and let's say white castles to defend it. He could also play queen f3, which we'll look at later. After castles, bishop to b7 threatens checkmate on g2. And there are a few ways to guard this one. Knight to f3, going back, prepares g5, the kingside pawn storm for black, is a very strong plan. He has a very powerful attack on the white king in this line. f3 is also possible, but it weakens the kingside structure, and after bishop c5 check, black develops with tempo. Queen f3 is the best move, and after black plays e4, I'm going to follow a game from 1976 where the white queen swung over to b3, attacking this pawn. Now, black should not defend f7 in this line because that is a very passive way to play, and this is an opening where black needs to attack. So black castled queenside in this game, allowing this knight fork of black's rooks. But black played e3, a very powerful move which threatens checkmate on g2. To block it, white has to do f3, and then the pawn advances again. The black e-pawn is turning into a monster. Bishop c5 check forces the king to go to h1, and then this rook comes over to get behind the pawn on e8. And in the game, white just took the rook on h8, but after knight to g4, all of black's pieces are involved in the attack, and white had to resign because there's no good way to stop knight f2 check. Notice all three of the queenside pieces for white are unmoved. So that is a possibility if black gives up his f7 pawn after the castles line. That's not the only way to defend g2. Queen f3 is also possible, delaying castling. Black is compelled to play e4, and then if the queen swings over to b3, black does not have time to castle, but he should still give up the pawn on f7 by playing bishop to c5. Now, if queen takes pawn check, the black king simply slides over. Black develops quickly in this line, whereas white is only playing with two guys. So black's king is actually quite safe. Say white plays knight c3, black has rook to f8 with potential tactics on f2. If the white queen just grabs this pawn, the rook comes over to g8, and the knight is unprotected, so the white queen would have to guard the knight, and then bishop takes f2 check. The bishop is untakeable because of the knight fork on g4. So that is a possible line after queen f3 instead of castles. And that is a look at bishop takes b5. In a recent tournament game in the Chicago Open, my opponent played pawn takes knight. And then I played pawn takes bishop, and my opponent played queen e2. I could have just played the bishop to d6 followed by kingside castle. But I played queen d5, guarding both the pawns, which is also acceptable. It attacks g2 as well. White played f4 to protect g2, and I pushed to e4, and this forces an ending. After knight to c3, queen takes pawn, knight takes, queen takes, knight takes. And in this position, white is up a pawn, but it's black's move, and the bishop pair is very powerful for him. After bishop f5, the c2 pawn is hanging, and the only way not to lose it is to play d3. But this gets rid of black's weakness and creates a weakness for white, which black can exploit by castling queenside and getting on the d-file, and this pawn is isolated. And I won the pawn back from d3 in this game, and I had good chances because of the bishop pair. So that is a sample line of what can happen after pawn takes knight. Now we'll look at the correct move, bishop to f1. And the reason this is correct is because the black needs to do something about the knight on c6. If queen takes, then knight to c3 attacks both of these guys. And if knight takes pawn, then the bishop comes all the way back out to b5, and queen to d5 is impossible here. So most books would recommend you play knight to d4, but I actually prefer the move h6. h6 allows white to play knight captures f7, but I think this is fine for black after king takes, pawn takes knight, bishop to c5. Black controls the squares in the center, and he might get a quick strike on f2 after he plays rook to f8 and king to g8. The black king is perfectly safe. And black will need to attack in this variation because he is down a couple of pawns. So that is knight takes f7. Another possibility is to retreat the knight to f3, but now that e6 is available for the black queen, this is not so bad, because now we're controlling more squares in the center. And after bishop takes b5, I can just develop, and after queenside castle and bishop c5, black controls the center again. So that is what happens after knight f3. Finally, pawn takes knight is clearly bad for white because he's only helped black by opening up the h-file to attack the white king. So these are some of the reasons why the Ulvestad in the two knights is part of my repertoire as black. Maybe after seeing this video it will be part of yours too. Until next time, good luck!